Grace's shift at Le Petit Seal had started like any other. The restaurant's polished floors reflected the soft glow of crystal chandeliers overhead, casting a golden light over the white tablecloths and perfectly arranged floral centerpieces. Each corner of the dining room exuded an air of elegance, from the sleek silver cutlery to the carefully curated wine list. The clink of glasses and the low murmur of well-dressed patrons filled the space, blending seamlessly with the hum of kitchen activity in the back. Grace moved through the space with practiced ease. Her uniform black slacks, a crisp white shirt, and a navy apron was always immaculate, her hair neatly tied back in a ponytail. She was quick with a smile, professional in every interaction, and always striving to make each customer feel like the most important person in the room. It was the kind of job that demanded both physical and mental stamina. Hours on her feet, running between tables, taking orders, refilling drinks, and keeping track of everything happening in the bustling dining room. It was relentless, but she had learned how to thrive in it. She was good at her job. Very good. But Grace was tired. She had been working at Le Petit Seal for 3 years, and while she was grateful for the steady paycheck, she knew there was more out there for her. She didn't mind the work itself, the fast-paced energy, the satisfaction of a job well done, the fleeting moments when she could exchange a few kind words with customers who appreciated her efforts. What wore on her was the knowledge that this life of late nights and early mornings, of endless tipping and calculated smiles, was all she had. She dreamed of a future beyond the restaurant. Of a life where she didn't have to apologize for existing, where she could afford to take a vacation without feeling guilty, where she didn't have to scrape by each month, always on the edge of financial instability. But dreams, for someone like Grace, felt like a luxury, something that existed only in the spaces between her shifts, fleeting and distant. And then there was Victor. Victor, a wealthy and arrogant millionaire, was a regular at the restaurant. He was the type of man who exuded entitlement with every word and gesture. Tall, with sharp features and an air of superiority, he never seemed to acknowledge anyone outside of his immediate circle. He had a way of speaking that made Grace feel like she was invisible, or worse, like she was somehow inferior to him. His eyes would slide over her, a lazy appraisal, before he would go on to complain about the smallest things. Sometimes it was the temperature of his wine, sometimes the texture of his steak, and sometimes it was just because it was Tuesday. Grace had learned not to take it personally. She had learned to smile through his insults, to nod and assure him that everything would be taken care of, even when her patience was worn thin. After all, he tipped well enough, and the job required a level of service she was committed to providing, no matter how undeserving the customer might be. But tonight, something felt different. The restaurant was busier than usual, and the pressure was building as the clock ticked past the dinner rush. Grace was managing 5 tables, each of them demanding attention, all while the kitchen sent out orders that needed to be served promptly. She could feel her pulse quicken as she rushed between tables, smiling, apologizing for delays, delivering food and drinks as efficiently as she could. Then, it happened. Victor had arrived just after the dinner rush, as always, demanding his usual seat by the window, a spot with the perfect view of the city skyline. Grace had greeted him with the same polite smile she always wore, and for a moment, she had hoped tonight would be different. Maybe he would be in a good mood. Maybe tonight he would be civil, even pleasant. But as soon as Grace set his wine on the table, she saw the flicker of irritation cross his face. Finally, he muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with disdain. "Took long enough." Grace blinked but didn't say anything. She had learned that responding to his rudeness only fed the fire. So, she offered her standard response, "I apologize for the delay, sir. It won't happen again." He glanced at her with an almost bored expression, clearly not interested in her apology, but he took the glass of wine from her hand nonetheless. As the evening wore on, his mood only soured. He barely touched his food, poking at his steak as though it had personally offended him. His eyes never left his phone as he scrolled through messages, occasionally muttering under his breath when the slightest thing went wrong. His glass wasn't full enough, the bread basket wasn't warm enough, the sauce was too tangy. Grace's heart raced as she continued to move between tables, all while keeping a watchful eye on Victor. It was exhausting, trying to anticipate his needs, trying to avoid the inevitable complaints that seemed to rise from nowhere. She had already checked on him twice, offering refills and asking if everything was to his liking, but his only response had been a curt, "Fine," before dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Then came the tipping point. Grace was delivering a dish to another table when she noticed Victor's hand rise in the air, signaling for her attention. She approached him cautiously, trying to maintain her composure. "Are you going to bring my dessert or are we going to sit here all night?" he asked, his voice sharp and impatient. "I'm sorry, sir," she replied, trying to keep her tone even, "there's been a slight delay in the kitchen. Your dessert will be out shortly." Victor scowled, his eyes narrowing. "You've been saying that all night," he said. "You've been running around like a headless chicken, and for what? So I can sit here and watch you waste my time." Grace felt her heart sink, but she kept her voice steady. "I assure you, I'm doing my best, sir." Victor's laugh was cold, a harsh bark of amusement that sent a chill through the air. "Your best? You think your best is good enough for people like me? I'm sure this job is fine for someone like you, but don't kid yourself into thinking you're going anywhere. This is the peak of your career, isn't it?" His words struck harder than they should have. It wasn't just the insult, it was the way he said it, as if her entire existence was nothing more than a footnote in the grand scheme of things. She had heard worse, yes, but there was something about this that felt different. It wasn't just about the job. It was about her as a person. It was about the life she had built, the life she was trying so desperately to escape. For a moment, Grace stood there, frozen, as the weight of his words settled in. Her face burned with the familiar sting of humiliation. But this time, something inside her snapped. She had been patient, she had been polite, and she had smiled through every condescending remark he had thrown at her. But not tonight. She looked him dead in the eye, the smile that had once been polite now gone, replaced by something steely and resolute. "You know what, Victor," she said, her voice low but firm. "You're right. This is the peak of my career. But you know what else? I don't need to prove anything to you. I don't need to justify my worth to someone who thinks they're better than everyone else." Victor's jaw tightened, but Grace didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away, the click of her heels against the marble floor echoing through the restaurant. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. She served the rest of her tables with a newfound sense of calm. The insults, the condescension, the long hours, none of it mattered. Grace knew she deserved better than this. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had the strength to fight for it. Grace had been subjected to insults from Victor countless times before. His sharp words, designed to belittle, had been a constant undercurrent in her life ever since she started working at the upscale restaurant. He was one of those customers who took pleasure in making others feel small, especially waitstaff like her. At first, Grace had brushed it off. She had smiled through it, nodding politely and walking away, always the bigger person in the face of his condescension. But today, something felt different. This time, when Victor's words cut through the air, they landed with a weight she hadn't expected. His usual mocking tone, his dismissive attitude, it all seemed sharper, more personal, more calculated. She could feel the familiar flush of heat creeping up her neck, but this time, it wasn't just embarrassment. It was anger, pure and unfiltered. Her hands, usually steady and practiced as she carried trays of food, trembled slightly. Her thoughts raced, trying to find a way to push through it, to escape the suffocating grip of frustration that clamped down on her chest. But she couldn't. The usual easy smile didn't come, and for the first time in years, Grace was paralyzed. Grace had always prided herself on her ability to keep a cool head, to rise above the petty jabs of entitled customers. She was resilient, everyone knew that about her. She had learned early on that in a world where people often tried to put you in your place, the best thing you could do was stand firm, keep your head down, and get through it. But today, the weight of Victor's insult felt different. It wasn't just another remark about her uniform or a backhanded comment about her job. It was an attack on her character, and it felt too much to bear this time. Her internal struggle was fierce. She was so tired of letting people like Victor think they could treat her like less than she was. Tired of being the silent, polite waitress who always took the high road. And yet, that was what she had done for so long. It was what she had always prided herself on, being the bigger person. But the frustration had built up over the years, and now it was threatening to break free. Grace wanted to tell him off, to confront him, but she didn't know how. The words didn't come. The retorts she had imagined in her mind felt foreign, unreal. She wasn't that kind of person. Or, at least, she didn't think she was. In the middle of the storm inside her, Grace's feet moved on their own, carrying her outside the restaurant, away from the buzzing noise of the dining room. The cool air hit her like a wave, a small relief from the tension that had begun to crack through her composure. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, to calm the whirlwind of anger that swirled inside her. Her eyes closed for a moment as she focused on the steady rhythm of her breathing. She could feel her pulse, fast and erratic, but as she exhaled, something shifted in her. She realized she was tired of the constant mistreatment, tired of holding back, tired of smiling when all she wanted to do was scream. This wasn't just about Victor anymore. It was about all the people, all the situations where she had been pushed down, ignored, or belittled. The weight of those small, constant slights had built up over the years, and now, it felt like too much. Grace had been silent for so long, but in this moment, she didn't want to be anymore. She felt a fire ignite in her chest, a spark, the beginning of something new. It wasn't about being rude, it wasn't about sinking to Victor's level. It was about taking back her power, her voice. She had always felt like she had to be the calm, composed one, the one who didn't make waves. But what if, just once, she let herself be the person who stood up for herself? What if she could do more than smile and walk away? As the thought settled in her mind, Grace felt a sense of liberation. The heavy burden of silence, the weight of tolerance that had held her back for so long, began to lift. She wasn't going to let Victor's words define her anymore. She wasn't going to be the invisible, quiet woman who let people like him walk all over her. When she stepped back inside, she could feel the atmosphere shift as soon as she re-entered the dining area. The room felt heavier, the air thick with unspoken tension. Victor was sitting at his usual table, his smug expression making her blood boil. She could hear him talking, his voice condescending as usual, but this time, Grace didn't feel the usual urge to retreat. This time, she was ready. With a steadying breath, she approached his table, her heart pounding in her chest. As she walked up to him, his eyes flicked up from his menu, a glint of recognition and amusement in his gaze. He didn't think anything of it. He didn't realize that this time would be different. "Can I help you, sir?" Grace's voice was calm, but there was a new edge to it, a quiet confidence that made him pause. Victor smirked, about to launch into another snide remark, but Grace interrupted him, her words sharp and precise. "You know, Victor, I'm really getting tired of this act. It's almost impressive how consistent you are with your insults. But you should know, they don't bother me anymore. Not the way they used to. I've learned a lot about myself, and I've learned a lot about people like you. And I've learned that I don't need to put up with it." There was a brief, stunned silence. Grace could feel the eyes of the other diners on her, the shift in the room as the air seemed to freeze for a moment. Victor blinked, caught off guard, his smirk faltering as he processed her words. He opened his mouth, likely to try and insult her again, but the words didn't come. Grace was no longer the timid, polite woman who let him get away with his behavior. She was no longer his target. Without waiting for him to respond, she turned on her heel and walked away, her steps sure and confident. As she moved through the room, she could feel the weight of the moment, the release of a pressure that had been building for years. Her heart still raced, but there was a new lightness in her chest, a feeling of empowerment that she had never experienced before. When she returned to the kitchen, her hands were steady, her pulse calm. A small, satisfied smile played at the corners of her lips. She had done it. She had stood up for herself, and it felt incredible. She didn't need anyone's approval or permission to speak her truth anymore. This was her life, and she was going to live it on her own terms. Grace had taken the first step toward reclaiming her power, and she knew this was only the beginning. She wasn't going to be silent anymore. This spark was just the start of something far bigger. And as she moved through the rest of her shift, she couldn't help but feel that her world had just shifted, ever so slightly, but it was enough to change everything. Victor's reaction to Grace's bold stand is one of utter disbelief, and the tension in the restaurant is palpable. The space, which had once buzzed with the usual hum of conversations and clinking silverware, now hangs heavy with silence. Grace, for the first time, has openly challenged Victor in front of everyone. She has pushed back against the man who has controlled the narrative for so long, refusing to bend to his will. In that single moment, she appears victorious. The power dynamic has shifted, and it feels like Grace has taken control of her own story. But victory is fleeting. The aftermath is far from the triumph Grace expected. Victor, a man who has always used his position of influence to manipulate and control those around him, is not one to be outdone. His silence is not one of concession but of a brewing fury that will soon explode. He is used to having the upper hand, to being the one who dictates the rules. Grace's defiance, especially in such a public and humiliating way, is something he cannot tolerate. For Victor, this is not just a challenge to his authority, it is a personal affront, one that he will make Grace regret. In the days that follow, Grace begins to feel the weight of Victor's retaliation. It's not immediate or overt. He doesn't storm into her life with grand gestures of anger. Instead, his revenge is far more insidious, creeping into her life in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. He starts to use his power and influence within the city to make her professional life more difficult. It begins with small passive-aggressive comments, little barbs hidden behind polite smiles and seemingly innocent words. But as the days go on, these comments become more frequent, and the subtle sabotage more apparent. At the restaurant, she's passed over for promotions or shifts in favor of others, some of whom seem to have suddenly aligned themselves with Victor. The once friendly atmosphere in the workplace starts to sour, and Grace is left feeling isolated, as if she is being pushed to the edges of her own life. Victor's influence extends beyond the walls of the restaurant. His network of contacts in the city ensures that the backlash against Grace spreads, creating an undercurrent of hostility. Customers who once smiled at her or shared brief, friendly conversations begin to treat her differently. Some of them even side with Victor, whispering about her defiance, painting her as difficult or problematic. It's as though the people she once counted on are now turning their backs on her, and Grace begins to question whether her stand was worth it. The emotional toll of being alienated by her peers, by those who once respected her, is exhausting. It's a lonely battle, and she finds herself questioning if she's strong enough to keep fighting. Yet, amidst the growing hostility, there's a flicker of something unexpected. Grace begins to notice small but significant changes in how people are treating her. Her co-workers, who once kept their heads down and avoided conflict, begin to show her a newfound respect. It's not loud or dramatic, but it's there in the way they speak to her, in the way they share tasks or take the time to support her when Victor's influence is being felt most strongly. There's a sense of solidarity among them, a quiet recognition that Grace has done something important. She has made a stand, and in doing so, she has earned the respect of those who had been too afraid to challenge the status quo themselves. Even some regular customers, those who had previously been indifferent to Grace, begin to treat her with more kindness. They stop to ask how she's doing, offer words of encouragement, and some even subtly express their admiration for her defiance. This shift, small as it is, brings a sense of hope to Grace. It's a reminder that not everyone is against her, that there are people who see her strength and are willing to stand with her. But it's also a reminder of how fragile that support is, how quickly it could disappear if she falters or Victor escalates his attacks. Grace's internal conflict becomes more pronounced as she processes these mixed signals. On one hand, she feels the weight of the backlash from Victor and his supporters. She feels the isolation, the sting of betrayal from those she once trusted. The loneliness that comes from being a target in a small world where power dynamics are so tightly controlled weighs heavily on her. Yet, at the same time, she is starting to feel something new, a sense of empowerment, however fleeting it might be. Standing up to Victor, despite the consequences, has sparked something in her. It has given her a taste of what it feels like to assert control over her own life, to take ownership of her narrative rather than let someone else write it for her. This internal conflict gnaws at Grace. She wonders if she has the strength to continue challenging the status quo, or if her act of defiance was merely a one-off, an isolated moment of bravery that she'll never be able to replicate. The consequences of her actions are harsh, and she's unsure if the cost is worth the brief taste of freedom she's experienced. She finds herself questioning whether she can truly stand up to Victor, day after day, without being consumed by the fallout. After all, Victor's power isn't just personal, it's institutional. His reach extends beyond the restaurant, beyond the city, and Grace knows that continuing to challenge him could bring even more severe consequences. But even as she struggles with these doubts, a part of Grace knows that there is no turning back. She has crossed a line, and the realization that she can stand up for herself, that she doesn't have to be a passive participant in her own life, is something she can't simply ignore. The taste of power, however small, is intoxicating. She begins to ask herself, if she can endure this backlash, if she can stand firm in the face of Victor's manipulation and power, what could she accomplish if she keeps going? In the quiet moments, when the weight of her choices presses on her, Grace feels a quiet but insistent stir inside her. She doesn't know where this will lead, but one thing is certain, she cannot go back to the way things were. She can't unmake the decision she's already made. And though she faces a difficult and uncertain road ahead, she realizes that this is her path now, for better or for worse. The battle isn't over, and she has no choice but to find a way to fight back. Grace's once clear-cut conflict with Victor begins to evolve in ways she didn't anticipate. Initially, she had seen him as the sole antagonist, an entitled, arrogant customer who felt no obligation to respect the people serving him. But as the days pass and her frustration with the situation deepens, Grace starts to realize that her perception of the conflict might be more one-sided than she thought. She had been focusing solely on the injustice of Victor's treatment of her, but there's more to the story than she initially understood. Victor's behavior is a product of a broader, more deeply ingrained societal issue. His privilege, his arrogance, and his apparent disregard for anyone beneath him aren't isolated traits, they're reflective of a larger power dynamic that Grace, as a working-class woman, has spent her life navigating without truly understanding its depths. It's a realization that shakes her to the core. Grace had always been taught to avoid confrontation, to stay in her lane, and to simply endure. But now, faced with this overwhelming injustice, she can't ignore it anymore. Yet, even as she stews in her own anger, she still feels out of place in the world of wealth and entitlement that Victor represents. That's when the unexpected happens. Samantha, a regular customer who had witnessed the altercation with Victor, steps forward as an ally. At first, Grace doesn't know what to make of Samantha. She's a successful entrepreneur, polished, confident, and seemingly worlds apart from Grace's own humble existence. But after the incident, Samantha begins to return to the restaurant more often, and with each visit, her interactions with Grace grow warmer and more supportive. Samantha, it turns out, has had her own share of struggles with the entitled elite. As a woman who has built her business from the ground up, she's no stranger to the pressure of constantly proving herself in a world that often undervalues women and people from working-class backgrounds. Over time, Samantha shares stories of her own experiences of being dismissed by wealthy men, of battling for respect in boardrooms full of privileged people, and of learning the hard way that confidence and self-worth often come from within, not from external validation. It's these conversations that change Grace's perspective. She begins to realize that Samantha, despite her success, understands her struggle in a way that no one else ever has. Samantha doesn't see Grace as someone to pity or look down upon, but as an equal, a person who deserves respect and recognition. Grace's sense of self-worth, which had always been tethered to her role as a server, starts to shift. She starts to believe, for the first time in years, that she is capable of more, that she doesn't have to settle for the limited role that society expects her to play. Samantha, who has spent years navigating the difficult intersection of privilege and hard work, becomes more than just an ally, she becomes a mentor. She offers Grace practical advice on how to handle the difficult power dynamics she faces at work and in life. Samantha encourages Grace to assert herself, to stop letting others walk all over her, and to fight for what she deserves. Grace is hesitant at first, unsure of how to navigate this new terrain. She has spent so long being docile and accepting of her place in the world that the idea of taking up space and demanding respect feels foreign. But with Samantha's support, she begins to practice these new skills. Samantha also pushes Grace to embrace her own potential. She helps her recognize the strength she already has within herself, the qualities that make her a valuable person both in and out of the workplace. For the first time, Grace starts to see herself as more than just a server, more than just someone working to get by. She begins to envision a future for herself that isn't defined by her current circumstances, a future where she can stand tall, assert her rights, and carve out a life of her own design. Meanwhile, Victor continues to make Grace's life difficult at work. He's not one to back down easily, and he's not content with just making her feel small during their interactions. He begins to leverage his position of power, pressuring the restaurant's management to make Grace's work life miserable. He complains about her to the higher ups, calling her unprofessional, demanding that she be reprimanded. For a moment, it feels like Grace is back at square one fighting an uphill battle against a man who holds all the cards. The restaurant management, being driven by the whims of wealthy customers like Victor, seems to waver under the pressure, hinting that they might take action against her. But this time, Grace is different. She has gained confidence through her conversations with Samantha, and she's no longer willing to let Victor's actions slide. She begins to fight back, but in a more subtle and deliberate way. Instead of letting Victor's disrespect slide, she stands her ground. When he makes demeaning comments, she responds with a calm, firm voice, asserting her right to be treated with respect. She doesn't back down when he tries to belittle her in front of others. When the management hints at reprimanding her, Grace calmly reminds them of her rights and the fact that she deserves fair treatment, just like any other employee. In addition to standing up to Victor, Grace starts to take on more responsibility at work, quietly proving her value to the management. She's no longer content to just do the bare minimum, she takes initiative, helps out when others need support, and shows her worth through her work ethic and dedication. In doing so, she starts to change the narrative that Victor and others may have tried to create about her. She refuses to be seen as just another server, just another faceless person working for tips. She is capable of more, and she's determined to prove it. Despite her newfound strength, Grace knows that Victor is far from finished. He's not the type to back down easily, and she knows that the battle is far from over. But with Samantha's mentorship, Grace is beginning to see the power she holds within herself. She's no longer the powerless woman she once was. She is capable, strong, and deserving of respect. The road ahead will be difficult, but for the first time in a long while, Grace feels ready to face it head on. She's not alone anymore. She has an ally in Samantha, and more importantly, she has found the strength to fight for herself. Victor's campaign against Grace had reached a new, more dangerous level. What started as passive-aggressive remarks and subtle attempts to undermine her had escalated into direct sabotage. He used his influence in the restaurant to ensure that Grace was assigned the worst shifts, late nights, the most difficult tables, and the busiest times when tempers were frayed, and the odds of a mishandled order were higher. Every minor mistake Grace made, he was there, ready to report it to the manager, exaggerating her errors, magnifying the smallest missteps until it seemed as though she was incompetent. All of it was calculated, part of his plan to break her down, to humiliate her into quitting. But something inside Grace had shifted. The pressure, the long hours, and Victor's continued harassment no longer had the same effect on her. Instead of shrinking away, she began to stand taller. The subtle undercurrent of intimidation he had tried to create in the restaurant no longer made her doubt herself. Instead of cowering when Victor spoke, Grace looked him directly in the eye. She had come to realize that Victor's attacks on her were more than personal, they were part of a larger system that sought to keep people like her in their place. He wasn't just trying to get her fired. He was trying to reinforce a structure that kept people like him at the top and people like her at the bottom. As the weeks passed, Grace's sense of self began to solidify. She refused to let Victor define her worth or her place in the world. She had spent too long thinking of herself as nothing more than a waitress, doing what she could to survive. But now, that role, once a source of shame, began to feel like a position from which she could rise and change her circumstances. The tipping point came one evening when she was assigned to handle a particularly difficult table. A group of well-dressed, demanding patrons had come in, expecting the best of service, but their requests bordered on absurd. Grace could feel the tension building. The patrons were getting impatient, and with Victor lurking in the background, she knew any slip-up would be quickly magnified. But instead of getting rattled, Grace took a deep breath and handled the table with poise. She made quick decisions, read the room, and kept her calm, even when the guests were rude. By the end of the night, not only had the table complimented her service, but other guests had noticed her ability to manage the situation under pressure. Word spread fast. Her co-workers began to approach her with admiration, talking about how she had diffused the tension, how she had handled the chaos without ever losing her cool. The once timid waitress who was easily intimidated had found a new confidence, one that allowed her to stand tall in the face of adversity. Her reputation in the restaurant began to shift from someone easy to push around, to someone who could not only take care of herself but others as well. Her wit, intelligence, and emotional intelligence became her greatest assets. In conversations with customers, she'd use humor to ease tense situations. With co-workers, she'd find ways to rally them together, easing their own stress with an encouraging word. People started asking for her section, not just for her service, but because they saw something in her, a strength, a kind of quiet resilience that couldn't be ignored. But Victor wasn't done with her. He was determined to see her fail, to prove that someone like Grace would always be beneath him. As the tension built between them, it was inevitable that they would clash again. The final confrontation came on a particularly busy Friday night. The restaurant was packed, and the energy in the air was electric. Patrons were loud, waitstaff were running back and forth, and the noise from the kitchen added to the frantic rhythm. Grace was managing her section with finesse, keeping everything under control despite the growing pressure. Victor, however, had been watching her all night. He had been waiting for her to slip, to make a mistake that would give him an excuse to make her look bad in front of everyone. It happened at the peak of the evening, when Grace's hands were full with an order that needed to be rushed to a table. One of the orders was incorrect, and she was forced to rush back to the kitchen to fix it, apologizing profusely to the customers in the process. It was a minor mistake, but Victor saw it as his chance. With a malicious grin, he sauntered up to the table and addressed the customer, using his usual condescending tone. "It seems like you're getting less than you deserve tonight. I'm afraid Grace isn't cut out for this job," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Maybe it's time we had someone more competent taking care of you." The room quieted, all eyes on Grace and Victor. The patrons at the table stared at him in confusion, but Victor wasn't done yet. He was trying to humiliate Grace, to make her appear unworthy of the job she had fought so hard to keep. For a brief moment, Grace's chest tightened with fury. The same fury she had felt when she first started working at the restaurant, when she had been made to feel small and unimportant. But this time, something was different. She wasn't scared. She wasn't shrinking away. Instead, She squared her shoulders and stepped forward. "Actually, Victor," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence, "you're the one who isn't cut out for this job." The words hung in the air. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Victor's smirk faltered, replaced with a flicker of confusion and then anger. "What are you talking about?" he snapped. Grace didn't flinch. "You think you can control everything, use your money and status to manipulate people like me into doing your bidding. But the truth is, you've been using your position to make others feel small because it makes you feel bigger. You talk about incompetence, but maybe you should take a look in the mirror. Maybe you should stop trying to tear down the people around you just to make yourself feel more important." The room went silent. The customers, the staff, everyone was watching, and for the first time, they weren't just passive observers. Grace had turned the tables, and she was holding her ground. Victor's face flushed with rage, but he couldn't respond. His words, his influence, his wealth, they had no power here. Not anymore. Grace had done something he never expected. She had exposed his hypocrisy, his manipulation, his weaknesses, in front of everyone. The man who had once towered over her, using his wealth and status as tools of control, was now nothing more than a small, embarrassed figure. For a moment, time seemed to stop. And then, slowly, the patrons began to clap. It started quietly, but then grew louder, a ripple of support spreading through the room. Grace had not only stood up to Victor, she had shown the entire restaurant what it meant to fight back against oppression, to find your voice when everyone tells you to stay silent. Victor, his face a shade of crimson, turned and stormed out of the restaurant, humiliated and defeated. As the clapping died down, Grace stood tall, her heart still racing but her spirit unbroken. She had won. Not just a battle with one man, but a battle for herself. And, in doing so, she had exposed the flaws in a system that thrived on inequality and manipulation. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had found her power. The backlash against Victor came faster than anyone could have anticipated. What started as a simple incident of public humiliation quickly spiraled into a full-blown scandal, and the fallout from Grace's stand reverberated far beyond the walls of the upscale restaurant. As word spread about his arrogance and mistreatment of Grace, the public response was swift and unforgiving. News outlets picked up the story, and social media erupted in outrage. The backlash was overwhelming, as people began to see Victor for what he truly was, a self-serving, manipulative man who wielded his power to belittle those he considered beneath him. The once untouchable business mogul now found himself at the center of a storm that threatened to unravel everything he had worked for. Customers who had once worshipped him now turned on him, demanding better treatment for Grace and calling for changes in the way the restaurant and, by extension, the entire industry treated workers in positions of vulnerability. The public, which had once turned a blind eye to the mistreatment of service workers, was now rallying around Grace, demanding justice for her and for all the people like her who had been subjected to similar abuses. What had started as an isolated incident of one woman standing up for herself had snowballed into a movement, one that had gained momentum faster than anyone could have predicted. Grace, with her courage in the face of Victor's cruelty, had unwittingly become a symbol of resistance against the entitled elite. The social media campaign in her honor spread like wildfire. Hashtags like #GraceIsNotInvisible and #JusticeForGrace flooded every platform, and the movement gained traction beyond the restaurant industry. Activists, workers' rights groups, and everyday people who had never met Grace were now rallying to her cause. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about standing up to the systemic abuses of power that often went unnoticed. Grace had inadvertently become the face of a much larger fight, and her voice, which had once been small and quiet, was now resonating across the country. But as the spotlight on Grace grew, so did the pressure. The attention was overwhelming, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. For the first time, she saw her own face plastered on news sites and social media, her name trending across platforms. She went from being an anonymous waitress in a busy restaurant to a public figure, thrust into the center of a political and social storm. Everywhere she went, people recognized her, and she found herself constantly surrounded by cameras, questions, and unsolicited advice from strangers. Grace had never signed up for this. She had never asked to be a symbol, never wanted to be at the forefront of a cause. She was just trying to survive, to make ends meet. But now, that very survival had catapulted her into a role she didn't feel prepared for. The newfound fame was both intoxicating and suffocating. People admired her for her bravery, for standing up to Victor when so many others had cowered in fear, but she didn't feel brave. She felt exposed. The world had expectations of her now, expectations that she wasn't sure she could meet. Grace had always been a private person, someone who kept her head down and stayed out of the limelight. But now, that very privacy was being stripped away, and she found herself constantly battling the fear of being misunderstood, misrepresented, or worse, exploited. Samantha, ever the supportive friend, was there to help Grace navigate this new reality. Samantha had always been the more outgoing one, the one who thrived in the spotlight, so she understood what it was like to be in the public eye. She became Grace's anchor, offering words of encouragement and advice when the pressure became too much. "Don't let them change you," Samantha would say, reminding her to stay grounded. "This isn't about you being perfect. It's about what you stand for." Samantha's reassurance gave Grace some comfort, but the weight of the situation still bore down on her. She was constantly torn between the life she had always known and the new, more complicated reality she was now living in. The tension inside Grace grew. She wasn't sure where she belonged anymore. The restaurant, which had been a place of stability for so long, no longer felt like home. The daily grind, the familiar faces of customers and co-workers, had taken on a new, suffocating quality. Now that she had tasted the power of standing up for what was right, the thought of returning to her old life felt almost unbearable. She no longer wanted to serve food to entitled people who saw her as nothing more than a cog in their social machine. The injustice that had once been invisible to her now felt too big to ignore. She had opened a door, and there was no going back. But at the same time, Grace was scared. Scared of what would happen if she left the restaurant, scared of the unknown, of stepping away from the only job she had ever known. There were so many uncertainties ahead. What if she couldn't find a new job? What if her newfound fame didn't translate into real opportunities? What if she was just a flash in the pan, someone who was relevant only because of the scandal, only to fade into obscurity once the next controversy came along? The internal conflict was maddening. Grace had always prided herself on being a worker, a provider, but now she was being asked to redefine who she was, to look beyond the confines of her current reality and imagine a future where she wasn't just surviving but thriving. Could she really leave behind everything she had known and step into a new world, one where she might have the power to make a difference beyond the confines of a restaurant? Could she seize the opportunity to change her life, to move into a world of business or activism, and use her voice for something bigger than herself? After days of wrestling with her emotions, Grace made the decision. She would leave the restaurant. The choice wasn't easy, and it wasn't made lightly, but it was one she felt she had to make. Grace could no longer ignore the call to something more, something beyond the four walls of a restaurant that had, in many ways, confined her spirit. The world was changing, and so was she. Her place in it was no longer behind a counter, waiting on people who saw her as invisible. She was done being silent. With her decision made, Grace handed in her resignation, surprising both her colleagues and her family. To many, it seemed like a risky move, even a foolish one. But for Grace, it felt like freedom, the freedom to choose her own path, to take the leap into a future she had once thought was out of reach. She was no longer just a waitress, she was someone who had sparked a movement. And that movement, she hoped, would lead her to a place where she could truly make a difference. As she walked away from the restaurant for the last time, Grace felt a sense of relief wash over her. It was terrifying, yes, but also exhilarating. She was stepping into the unknown, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was doing something that was hers. Something that truly mattered. Grace sat alone at the small kitchen table in her apartment, staring at the list of career possibilities in front of her. She had been writing and crossing out ideas for hours, each one feeling more out of reach than the last. The silence around her felt deafening, but it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that made her aware of how little she truly knew about what came next. What was her future? What was her purpose beyond the restaurant? She could still see the glossy wood floors, the chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, and the faces of the people who had walked through the restaurant's doors, victims of her own ambition. The place had once felt like a sanctuary. It had been her lifeline, the place where she'd been able to hide from the world, a place where she could forget the years of struggle and pain. But that had changed. The decision to leave hadn't been easy. It felt like stepping into a void, a great unknown, without a clear path forward. The restaurant had been her security blanket, a constant in a life filled with uncertainty. But now, with her resignation letter handed in and the finality of her choice settling in, Grace was beginning to understand that staying in that job was like choosing to remain in a cage. The fear of change had kept her trapped for so long, but now, the idea of freedom, the idea of walking away and finally carving out a life of her own felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Samantha had become her sounding board throughout this period. Grace could always count on her to offer insight, perspective, and encouragement when she felt paralyzed by doubt. It was Samantha who had gently nudged her toward the idea of creating her own future, helping her see that her skills and intelligence weren't just valuable to the restaurant industry. There were other paths, more fulfilling paths that Grace had never considered before. Despite her fear, Grace was beginning to listen to Samantha's advice. She had spent so many years trying to survive, to get by day to day, that she had never allowed herself the luxury of dreaming bigger. But now, as her resignation from the restaurant marked a clean break from her past, she couldn't help but feel that it was time to dream again. The thought of starting her own business had always been something Grace considered in fleeting moments, passing thoughts that she quickly dismissed as too risky or out of reach. But now, with the steady encouragement of Samantha, she was starting to consider it seriously. Could she really launch something of her own? Could she take the skills she had honed managing the restaurant and transform them into a successful business? The idea of becoming her own boss, of building something from the ground up, excited her. But it also terrified her. What if it failed? What if she wasn't enough? The other option, stepping into a leadership role at a company, also seemed like a real possibility. Grace had always been good at organizing, at seeing the bigger picture, at keeping things running smoothly. Her experience managing the restaurant and overseeing complex operations had prepared her for a leadership role in almost any industry. But would she be taken seriously in a corporate setting? The thought of competing with people who had decades of experience, who had climbed the traditional corporate ladder, made her wonder if she could truly fit in. The choices before her felt overwhelming. The world suddenly seemed vast, filled with opportunities, but also fraught with uncertainties. Every time she took a step toward one possibility, another one appeared, just out of reach, presenting its own set of challenges. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be moments when she'd feel like turning back. But there was a strength growing inside her, a quiet confidence she hadn't known she was capable of. The more she considered her options, the more she realized that the fear of failure couldn't hold her back forever. She had taken the biggest step already by walking away from her old life. Now, it was time to figure out what came next. While Grace wrestled with the enormity of her decision, Victor's empire was beginning to crumble. The restaurant he had once built into a success was now losing clients left and right, and business deals that had once seemed guaranteed were falling apart. Word of Victor's past behavior had started to leak into the public eye, painting him as the arrogant, entitled man he had always been behind closed doors. The business community, which had once adored him for his connections and wealth, was beginning to turn on him. Grace had heard whispers about Victor's downward spiral. People were beginning to talk, and they were no longer willing to ignore the patterns of his behavior. The stories of his manipulation, his abuse of power, were finally being exposed. Where once he had commanded admiration, now he was met with suspicion and disdain. The once invincible Victor was losing everything, and it felt, for the first time in a long while, like the balance of power was shifting. For Grace, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about watching someone fall and feeling vindicated. But there was a sense of justice in it, a sense that, finally, the truth was being told. For years, she had been a part of Victor's world, too afraid to speak out, too afraid to leave. Now, she saw the public's growing disillusionment with him as a small victory for everyone who had ever been crushed by his arrogance. His downfall was no longer about Grace. It was about everyone who had been affected by the toxic system he had built. Through it all, Grace began to see herself differently. No longer a victim of circumstance, she started to realize that she had power, too. She had the ability to choose, to take control of her own future. She had been part of a system that kept her small, but she no longer needed to play by those rules. With each passing day, she began to understand that her value didn't lie in the approval of powerful men or in the success of others' enterprises. It was in her own ability to build something meaningful, something true to who she was. The thought of stepping into the unknown was still daunting, but Grace now saw it as an opportunity rather than a threat. She had lived for so long under the weight of other people's expectations, but now she could choose a path of her own making. She didn't have to fit into a mold that wasn't meant for her. Her journey wasn't defined by where she had been, but by where she was willing to go. That night, as Grace sat at her kitchen table, her eyes scanning the list of career possibilities once more, she felt a spark of determination. She had been standing at the edge of her future for too long, too afraid to take that first step. But now, she could see the path in front of her. It wasn't clear, and it wasn't easy, but it was hers to shape. The next morning, Grace made a decision. She was going to attend a business networking event. It wasn't a huge step, but it was a step. A step toward a future that was hers to create. It was the beginning of something new, something uncertain, but something full of promise. And for the first time in a long while, Grace felt ready. The grand ballroom was alive with the hum of conversation, clinking glasses, and the rustling of expensive suits. Grace felt the weight of it all pressing down on her the moment she stepped through the door. The walls of the room were lined with polished wood and towering windows that framed the city skyline, an impressive backdrop for the gathering of influential entrepreneurs. She glanced around, her pulse quickening. Everyone looked so accomplished, so confident. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. A part of her, the part that had come so far since her days waiting tables at the diner, wanted to turn around and leave. But she couldn't. This event was a chance she had worked hard for, a step toward a future she had only dreamed about when she was pouring coffee for people who barely noticed her. She had earned the invitation, had earned the right to stand among these people, but standing there now, she felt smaller than she ever had. She tugged at the hem of her jacket, her thoughts spiraling. What was she even doing here? What could she offer these people, most of whom had built empires from the ground up? They didn't know her story, and frankly, she wasn't sure they'd care. To them, she was just another person from the service industry, someone who had no right to occupy a space in their world. Grace took a deep breath and scanned the room. She spotted Victor in the distance, deep in conversation with a group of well-dressed men. He had invited her to this event, pushed her to step out of her comfort zone. She admired him for his confidence, the way he moved through the crowd with ease, as though he had always belonged. But that wasn't her. Not yet. As she walked further into the room, she felt eyes on her. It wasn't in the way she had hoped. People were sizing her up, evaluating her in a way that made her skin crawl. The voice in her head whispered that she was an imposter, that she didn't belong here. The waitress from the past, the woman who had served their meals and cleared their tables, was still alive inside her. It was hard to shake the weight of that history, even though she had worked so hard to leave it behind. The feeling of being out of place intensified when she found herself standing by the bar, nursing a drink she didn't really want. She glanced at the panel set up for the evening's discussion, where a few prominent business figures were preparing to speak. Her name was on the list for the panel discussion later, but right now, all she wanted to do was melt into the background. She wasn't ready for this, she wasn't ready to speak to these people. But then she remembered something Samantha had told her during their last conversation: "You've already done the hard part. You've made it this far, Grace. Now, just show up as yourself." No one can argue with that. Samantha's words echoed in her mind, and slowly, the self-doubt began to fade. Grace was here for a reason. She had something to offer, something unique. And even if it felt like she didn't belong, she knew she deserved to be here. The panel began, and Grace reluctantly made her way to the stage, where she joined the others. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, their judgment heavy. The moderator, a well-known investor with an air of authority, introduced her last. Grace Holden, the entrepreneur behind the innovative startup Fresh Start, a company committed to sustainable living and offering eco-friendly solutions to everyday problems. "Welcome, Grace," he said with a warm smile, but his words barely registered in her mind. As the panel progressed, Grace found herself listening to the others with growing unease. They were well-spoken, confident, and polished. They spoke with authority about their businesses, their strategies, their successes. Everything they said seemed so effortless, so in control. And then it was her turn. "Grace, tell us a little bit about your journey," the moderator prompted. For a moment, Grace froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. She was supposed to be the one with a story, an inspiring tale of triumph against all odds. But all she could think about was the small diner she had once worked in, the tables she had cleared, the tips she had relied on to make ends meet. She could feel the weight of those memories threatening to pull her back into the shadows. But then, something shifted. She remembered Victor's words, "You're not the girl who used to serve coffee anymore. You're the woman who built something from nothing." And for the first time that evening, she realized the truth of it. She had come so far. She had worked for every success, every step forward. The person she was now was not the same one who had waited tables all those years ago. She was someone who had fought for her place in this world. And she wasn't about to let anyone forget it. Taking a deep breath, Grace began. "I grew up in a small town, where everyone had their place," she started, her voice steady despite the nerves. "I spent years working as a waitress, waiting on people who barely noticed me, and I thought that would be my life. But then I realized something every day. I was learning, observing, growing. The people I served weren't just customers to me. They were a reflection of what I wanted for my life. I wanted more than just a paycheck. I wanted purpose. And so, I set out to build something that would help people live better, more sustainable lives. Something that would make a real difference." She paused, scanning the room. The faces that had once looked down on her were now listening, paying attention. She continued, feeling a spark of confidence ignite inside her. "I know what it's like to start with nothing. I know what it's like to feel invisible. But I also know what it takes to rise above those things. To turn your passion into action and to create something that's meaningful. That's what Fresh Start is, an opportunity for people to change the way they live, to make a difference every day, one small choice at a time." As Grace spoke, she felt herself becoming more comfortable, more certain. Her words flowed naturally, and for the first time that evening, she felt like she was in control. The story she had always carried within her, the one that had felt too small and insignificant, now seemed powerful and relevant. Her vision was real, and it was one that mattered. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. And then, to her surprise, a slow clap began from one corner of the room. Others joined in, the applause growing louder, more genuine. Grace's heart swelled in her chest. She had done it. She had shared her story, and it had resonated with people. She had proven to herself and to everyone else that she belonged here. By the end of the evening, Grace had made several valuable connections, each person expressing genuine interest in collaborating with her on future projects. She felt the weight of her past lift off her shoulders as she realized how far she had come. The business world, once so intimidating, was no longer a place where she felt like an outsider. It was her world now too, and she had just claimed her space in it. Walking out of the ballroom, Grace's steps were light. The room she had once felt so out of place in now seemed like a starting point, a launching pad for the next phase of her journey. She had found her voice, and she was ready to take on whatever came next. Grace stood at the window of her sleek new office, gazing out at the bustling city below. The hum of life outside mirrored the buzz of activity inside her head. A few months had passed since the pivotal networking event where everything had changed, and in that time, Grace had not only rebuilt her life but had also transformed it in ways she never thought possible. She had launched her own consultancy, a business centered around empowering individuals to challenge social inequalities, fight for their rights, and create a more just world. It was a cause that had long been close to her heart, but one she had been too afraid to pursue until now. Looking back, Grace could hardly believe how far she had come. The decision to stand up for herself at that event, to speak out against the injustices that had been perpetuated for so long, had been the catalyst for a series of changes that rippled outward. It wasn't just about her personal liberation, it was about something much larger. The courage to take that first step had ignited a movement, and now, months later, Grace was leading that movement, using her platform to challenge the status quo and push for systemic change. The consultancy had grown quickly, gaining clients who were eager to take a stand, to demand accountability from the institutions and systems that had long oppressed them. Grace's reputation as a fierce advocate for fairness had spread across the industry, and she was now recognized as one of the most influential voices in the fight against social inequality. She was invited to speak at conferences, to lead workshops, and to advise on important policy reforms. But even more gratifying than the recognition was the sense of fulfillment that came from knowing she was making a real difference. In the process, Grace had built a community of like-minded individuals who shared her vision. Her work had inspired many to take bold steps in their own lives, to challenge systems of power that they once thought were insurmountable. People who had once felt powerless, voiceless, now found strength in her words and actions. They saw in Grace a reflection of their own struggles and a guide to a path toward justice. She had become not just a consultant, but a beacon of hope. As Grace's influence grew, so too did the stark contrast between her newfound success and the downfall of the man who had once held so much sway over her life, Victor. Where Grace had risen, he had fallen. His wealth and influence had evaporated, his name now tarnished by his past actions. The scandal surrounding his unethical business practices had done irreversible damage to his reputation. The empire he had built had crumbled, and with it, his self-assurance. Victor, once a towering figure in the business world, now lurked in the shadows of his former life. The things that had made him powerful, his manipulative tactics, his ability to control others, had been exposed for what they were, and he had no way of reclaiming what he had lost. Grace had watched his decline with a mix of satisfaction and pity. It wasn't just his fortune that had slipped away, it was his dignity, his credibility, his very essence. He had been consumed by the same forces of greed and entitlement that he had wielded for so long. In contrast, Grace had embraced the values of integrity, transparency, and empathy. She knew that her journey hadn't been easy, that standing up for herself had come with risks. But in the end, it had been worth it. She had reclaimed her sense of self, her purpose, and, ultimately, her life. The fear and uncertainty that once clouded her decisions had been replaced with a quiet confidence. She had learned to trust herself and her instincts, and that trust had propelled her forward into the life she now led. As she thought about the journey that had brought her here, Grace felt a deep sense of pride. It wasn't just the success of her business that made her proud, it was the way she had stayed true to her values, the way she had remained unshaken in her commitment to fairness and justice. She had never compromised on her principles, even when it would have been easier to do so. She had fought for what was right, even when it had seemed impossible. And in doing so, she had not only changed her own life but had impacted the lives of countless others. Looking around her office, Grace felt a surge of gratitude. The space wasn't just a reflection of her success, it was a symbol of the freedom she had fought for. It was a place where her voice could be heard, where her ideas could take shape and flourish. Every corner of the room spoke to the journey she had undertaken, from the small desk where she first began to map out her consultancy to the expansive windows that now framed her view of the world she was actively shaping. For a moment, Grace allowed herself to reflect on how far she had come. She had been trapped in a cycle of fear and self-doubt, but now she was standing at the forefront of her own success. The woman who had once been afraid to speak up was now a force to be reckoned with. She had redefined her worth, not by the standards of those who had once held power over her, but by her own measures. The final piece of the puzzle, however, was the realization that her journey was far from over. Grace's work was just beginning. There was so much more to be done, so many more people to help, so many systems to change. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but she was no longer the person she had been when she started. She was stronger, wiser, and more capable than ever before. And with that strength came an unwavering commitment to continue fighting for justice, to continue using her voice to advocate for those who had been silenced for far too long. As Grace stood in her office, she felt the weight of her accomplishments settle comfortably within her. She had proven to herself that she was capable of achieving anything she set her mind to. But more than that, she had proven that standing up for what was right could lead to a world of possibility. Her influence was growing, her impact expanding, and the future was filled with promise. With a confident smile, Grace turned away from the window and walked back to her desk. There was work to be done, and she was ready for it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she was equipped to face them. She had transformed her life, and now she was ready to help others do the same. The final shot of the day was of Grace standing tall, the city stretching out before her, a symbol of all she had accomplished and all that was yet to come. With her head held high and her heart full of purpose, Grace was ready for the next chapter of her journey. The new dawn had arrived, and she was ready to seize it.